This PowerPoint will introduce you to what biblical scholars call the documentary hypothesis and explain its importance in understanding the literature of the Old Testament. Along the way, I'll ask you a few times to take a minute and think a little more in depth about some of the ideas and claims we'll be making in this presentation. When that happens, you should pause the video and write down your thoughts so you can refer to them later and so that we can talk about them in class if need be. And please remember that it's called the documentary hypothesis for a reason. That is, it's an attempt to explain certain questions and issues, and, like all hypotheses, it's only useful if it explains those questions and issues more fully and accurately than other hypotheses. And to this point in the history of biblical scholarship, it has done so. As early as the 17th century, readers of biblical texts began to notice that discrepancies and repetitions existed in what we call the Pentateuch or the Torah, that is, the first 5 books of the Bible, or Genesis through Deuteronomy. Probably the first important scholar to take up this problem in the modern era was Richard Simon, a 17th century Catholic priest. Simon argued that Moses wrote the basic core of the Pentateuch, but that there were also additions made by later scribes and collectors of this material. Simon's ideas weren't well received. He was excommunicated, and almost all of his books were burned. In the 19th century, 2 German scholars came to formulate what would become the classic statement of the documentary hypothesis. These 2 German scholars were Karl Heinrich Graf and Julius Wellhausen. The scheme they developed is worked out in detail in Wellhausen's classic book, Prolegomena to the History of Israel, which was published in 1878 and 1883. Basically, the conclusions of Wellhausen's book are as follows. The Pentateuch is composed of 4 sources: the J or Yahwist source, the E or the Elohist source, D, the Deuteronomist, and P, the priestly source. Most scholars, even today, still accept the basic outlines by which Wellhausen reached his conclusions. Before we dive into Genesis chapters 1 to 3, let's list what scholars have traditionally seen as the evidence of multiple authors in the Pentateuch. These include variations in the divine names, that is, the Hebrew words used to indicate God vary among different texts. Second, doublets, that is, the presence of 2 similar or near identical stories. Third, various inconsistencies in plots or the details therein. Fourth, special interest in specific regions in one story over and against others. Next, the presence of odd chronological indicators and anachronisms. For example, the mention of something in a given story that couldn't have been present in that time. And finally, the fact that in many of these stories we find a wide variance in literary style and vocabulary. It wasn't just the fact that scholars noticed these 6 pieces of evidence. It was also the fact that scholars discovered that most of the time these variations lined up with one another. That is, one story might show a particular regional interest and may also have specific vocabulary and distinct details that differ from another story. This growing mass of data helped scholars to identify and then describe different sources written by different authors at different times for different purposes within the Torah. Over the years, scholars came to a general agreement as to the dates and origins of these sources, as well as the shorthand names we use to identify them. In the image on the left side of this slide, you can see the results of such an endeavor in the classic formulation of the documentary hypothesis. There are 4 sources listed here, each of which has its own specific style, date, and theological outlook. And sometime during the late 6th or 5th centuries, someone, usually called the editor or the redactor, collected and edited all these disparate sources together into the Pentateuch as we now know it. Since we're really only focusing on Genesis 1 to 3, we won't talk about the E or the D source in this presentation, but these will probably come up in our class. This chronological chart of the development of the Pentateuch gives you a more comprehensive overview of how these sources developed and how they were eventually edited together. Again, keep in mind that this is an academic hypothesis whose purpose it is to explain the 6 pieces of evidence, as well as others, I mentioned a minute ago. If it's doing its job well, it's answering more questions and explaining more details than other hypotheses. And as I mentioned, at this point in the history of biblical research, it's doing its job pretty well. In the first 3 chapters of Genesis, only 2 of the 4 Pentateuchal sources are present, J and P. Briefly, J was probably an official history of Israel commissioned during the 10th century BCE, that is, the time of the United Monarchy under King David. J consistently uses a term that I have abbreviated YHWH, or in Hebrew, Yod He Vav He, for God, which in English translations is normally rendered as Lord. The reason we call this source J is linked to this word for God. German doesn't have the letter Y in its alphabet, so German scholars used the letter J as the first letter of this divine name instead of Y. Not only is this why we call this source the J source, it's also where the divine name Jehovah comes from. The J source has a distinctly folkloric quality. The deity is very anthropomorphic, and the characters are not idealized types, but presented as real people. J probably has its roots in the southern kingdom of Judah, as it focuses on the tribe of Judah, as well as southern people, places, and shrines. On the other hand, P was most likely composed during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, or at the end of the Babylonian exile, sometime between 550 and 450 BCE. P was probably composed as a theological alternative to the historical stories found in J and other Pentateuchal sources. P is interested primarily with ritual, laws, genealogy, and the religious cult. And the deity is central and powerful in that he dictates and sustains cosmic order. God does so through the intermediary practices of the priesthood, which is why we call this the P source. In the opinion of P, the priestly line that traces its roots back to Moses' brother Aaron is the only appropriate intermediary between the people and God. Now that we've talked about different sources in the abstract, let's get more specific and examine one particular section of text as a way of illustrating how the documentary hypothesis works. The vast majority of biblical scholars agree that there are 2 sources present in Genesis chapters 1 to 3, the J source and the P source, and they both seek to describe the creation of the world as well as the creation of humans. The P source is present in Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a, and the J story is found in Genesis 2:4b through 3:24. There are 8 reasons for claiming that there are 2 different stories of creation in Genesis 1 to 3. First is the issue of syntax, which isn't immediately apparent to those of you who don't read Hebrew. The first 3 clauses of both stories are the same linguistically. They're both temporal, circumstantial, and finite clauses. In other words, this is how you begin a story. The second reason is much more obvious, namely theology, or how God is portrayed. In the P story, the deity is transcendent and creates by speaking. In J, the deity is anthropomorphic, or like a human, and creates by molding or shaping. Third, the use of vocabulary, which again isn't immediately obvious in English. What I mean by that is, the terms for the deity are different in both accounts. Also, verbs for creation and terms for gender are different. In the P story, again found in Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a, the verb for creation is bara, to create, which is used exclusively with the deity. But the verbs in the second story, the J story, are much more common. The first instance of creation in the J account, again Genesis 2:4b through 3:24, is articulated by the verb asa, to make or to do, an extremely common verb. The second verb used in chapter 2 verse 7 is yatsar, meaning to form or to shape, as a potter or an artisan would, another very common verb. Also, fourth, the vocabulary used for gender identification is also different in both stories. The P account uses uncommon words for male and female, zakar for male and nekeva for female. These are both words that also could be used to indicate a male or a female animal. In contrast, the J source uses much more common terms, ish for man and isha for woman. Fifth is literary style. The first story is a formal statement, and some scholars think it represents a type of liturgy. The second story, the J story, is just that, a story. The role of humans in the stories is sixth. In the first story, humans have dominion over all of creation. The verb used in Genesis 1:26 is radah, which carries the connotation of subduing, ruling, or governing. In the second story, these humans are farmers, and they're tied closely to the land. Seventh is the issue of the scope of creation. In the first story, the writer deals with the whole cosmos. In the second, the scope is much more particular, dealing with the human world. Eighth and finally is the order of creation. In the first story, the P story, humans are made last after animals are created. In the second, or the J story, humans are made before any animals at all. The following chart demonstrates the discrepancies in order. Pause the video to review this chart closely. Then, take a minute and ask yourself, why is there such a discrepancy? If you find the documentary hypothesis persuasive, then the answer to that question is simple. That is, there's a discrepancy because we have two different stories and there's no requirement for them to cohere or be similar. But if you don't find the documentary hypothesis persuasive, what then? How might you then explain the discrepancy within the bounds of what we can prove historically? In conclusion, even though most scholars accept the documentary hypothesis in some fashion, there is still debate over its precise formulation, just as you would expect with any hypothesis. As John J. Collins notes, though, quote, "Perhaps the main lesson to be retained is that these texts are indeed composite and incorporate layers from different eras. The biblical text is not a systematic treatise. Rather, it is a collection of traditional materials that laces different viewpoints in dialogue with one another and offers the reader a range of points of view." End quote. Put differently, these texts stem from different times and different ideological communities. They have different foci and different purposes. However, they both address the questions of identity and behavior. That is, they were written in the hopes of establishing an identity for the writer's audience and followers that would regulate and control behavior. The dual emphasis on identity and theology marks these texts as sacred myths, and as far as myths shape our sense of self by sanctioning certain types of behavior, explaining the origins of evil, and providing a moral order to our surroundings, as well as by the fact that these stories perform these functions within a religious context. People throughout history have turned to these stories to find meaning, to find out who they are. As such, they serve as a fitting prelude to the story of the formation of the covenant community.